Welcome. This is Megan Mitchell with Agents of Change Social Work Test Prep. And today I'm here to talk about another study tip. And this is something that comes up a lot with people, especially people that are not learners that do best by just reading a textbook. They often feel that reading a textbook can be overwhelming, and they're just very, very overwhelmed with lots of text on a page. So today we are going to discuss active versus passive reading and how you can process written information so that you can increase your chances of success on the ASWB exam. And we're specifically going to talk about social work texts, something that's a little bit more academic based, and give you some tips on when you're studying how you can kind of break down large chunks of written information. So there is active reading and passive reading. We're going to cover what the two are. When you are reading an academic textbook or something that has a lot of intellectual content, you are going to want to employ active reading. So what is that? Active readings when we use deeper engagement with the text before we read the text, while we're reading the text, and then after reading the text. So active reading really is a process, right? There's a lot of planning that goes into it, and there's a lot of afterwards, there's a lot of reflection after. So active reading is when you go in with a purpose. So you know why you're going into doing the reading assignment. You have questions in the back of your mind, or maybe you have even written down questions or have an outline. And this often is when you're going to be taking notes or annotating. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. It is not just highlighting every word that you read in a book or rewriting everything that you read. So we'll talk about what that means when you're active reading and taking good notes. So that's active reading. That's really what we're looking for when we're reading an academic text. Then there's passive reading. What is passive reading? Passive reading is when you're just reading the words, right? You open the book, you start at the beginning and you just read through, but you're absorbing next to nothing about what is written and why. So passive reading would be if you're reading for fun, right? You're on the beach, you're on vacation, you open up your book, you're kind of tuning out, but there's no big questions that you're pondering and you're not examining what you're reading. So passive reading, it doesn't really have a purpose. It's like I said, usually for pleasure. There's no questions in mind, and you're not doing that reflective or that piece where you're analyzing what you read. So like I said, passive reading is great. Passive reading really helps people de-stress. It really helps people when they're on vacation, or if it's just a hobby, or some people just enjoy reading. I'm someone that loves to passively read, but the way that I engage with a book that I'm reading on vacation or at night before I go to bed is very different than how I would read when I'm reading a textbook. Also, active versus passive reading. Passive readings usually maybe you're laying on the couch or you're laying in bed. Not much mental or physical stamina is needed for the passive reading. Where active reading is you really want to be in a workspace, you want to be able to take notes, you want to be in more of that professional setting when you're reading. Here's a nice little visual of passive versus active reading. Like we said, passive is when you're reading for pleasure. You read everything at the same speed, right? When I'm reading a novel, I just flip through the pages. I'm not stopping. I'm not usually going back. I'm not annotating. You usually take no notes or too many notes. This is the thing. Sometimes if you are someone that's just going through and highlighting everything, I am very bad about this. That's passive reading, right? Because when you go and highlight everything, you're not retaining very much. Passive readings when you read from beginning to end, right? You don't kind of break down what you're reading, and you begin reading without a plan. You just open up the book, you open up the text, and you begin reading. We're trying to avoid this when we are studying for the exam, because we know that when we're engaging in passive reading, we are not going to retain as much, and we're not going to be able to tap into those application, reasoning, and critical thinking skills. Active reading, that's when you adjust your reading based on the text. So Depending on the length of the text, depending on the topic of the text, you're going to adjust how you read. Maybe you have to go back and read it 2 times, or maybe you are starting, maybe it is a research article. So maybe you are not reading that from start to finish, but maybe you're pulling out important information that has to do with maybe the study that was being conducted. When you're actively reading, and I tell you that this is a really good skill, you want to skim first and then make a plan. So if you're opening a book, a study book to sit down for the social work exam, skim what you want to read first so that you can kind of in your head make an outline or a plan. I do not suggest picking up the Dawn Apgar book and just reading it front to back, right? There's so much good content in there. You want to skim it first, outline, and think about, how do I want to approach this? When you're actively reading, you want to stop throughout. So if you're reading, and you feel like you're not retaining anything, you got to come up with a new plan, right? Maybe break it down even more. And you should be assessing your progress throughout. So you don't want to waste time. You don't want to be 2 hours into a study session and you've been reading and you've retained maybe one definition. That's not going to be helpful. So active reading causes you to stop, think, and evaluate. And then active reading, when you're done with the text, you want to reflect on what you read. You want to, in your mind, think of 3 takeaway points. So even if you read a paragraph, it could be a very dense, it could be a very academic language-based article with a lot of really tough terms. You can stop after a paragraph and say, what did I just read? What are maybe 3 takeaways that I want to take? And you want to evaluate what you have read. So this is kind of being really in the driver's seat of your own reading, so that you are able to retain and have takeaways from each session when you sit down to read. We are going to open a sample text here. I just want you to, I'm just going to scroll for a little bit. I want you to think about how you would approach this text. Okay. Introduction to Macro Practice in Social Work. This is a 31-page document. I see charts. I see different paragraphs, different chapters. So I want you to think, how would you break this down? What's great about academic textbooks is they usually have outlines. So you can see here, it tells you what page numbers different chapters fall under. It's going to end with case examples. So what I would do before you even start is always look at the outline, or if there's a table of contents. That's going to really, really, really help you. So here what I would do is I would say, you know what, today I'm going to conquer macro practice in context. And what is macro practice? From there, I would probably get a piece of paper. I would write down macro practice. And what do I want to get from that? Like, when I think of macro practice, what does that mean? So maybe that would be a question you're hoping to ponder. What is macro practice, right? So this is just an example. And then when you get into it, you might read this one paragraph, and this is just an intro so you can keep going to the next one. You might want to take notes in the margins, or you might want to give yourself an extra sheet of paper to continue doing your notes. That's totally up to you. Let's jump back here. So we talked about how you would approach this text. Now let's talk about how you would apply those active reading strategies. Before you read, why are you reading, right? If you are reading a chapter on clinical supervision, what do you want to know about that? Do you want to know how it applies to code of ethics? Do you want to know how it applies in hospital settings? There's a variety of different things that you might be wanting to get out of that text. So determine why you're reading this. Write down questions you'd like to answer, and you might not have very specific questions. That's okay. They can be broad or specific. And then, like we mentioned, preview a text before reading. Look at the headlines, look at the topic sentences and keywords. While you're reading, adjust how you read. You do not have to read every word of a textbook. Actually, in some of my grad school classes, they said when you're getting a research article, you actually want to read the discussion first, and you might read start at the end of the article first and then jump back to the beginning. So you don't have to read everything word from word, starting at the first word and ending with the last word. It just depends what you're reading. If you have a book that has definitions, you might just use the table of contents, look up the words or the phrases or the concepts that you're struggling with and flip to that page. If you have a really solid handle on something, you by no means have to read every word of that in the book. Also remember to stop and ask yourself, did I just understand what I'm reading? Also, I do this often. I'm reading and something's just not really clicking for me. I sometimes do a Google search to see if maybe there's a YouTube video out there, or if there is some sort of other article that maybe would help me learn it in a different way. And that's been really helpful. Annotate and take notes while you read. You don't want to write too much and you don't want to write too little. Only take notes, or if you do write a lot of notes, you want to go back and pare that down at the end of your study session. After you read, we talked about this, reflect upon what you read and evaluate, right? You should have some key takeaways from what you read. And those questions that you came in with, can you answer them now? So, do you know what clinical supervision is? How is clinical supervision used in hospitals? You can go back to your notes, right? This is for your own purposes. There's no right or wrong answer when you are reading. Why should we do active reading? There's a ton of science behind it, but basically it will help you retain the information better. I don't know about you or how frustrating it's been anytime you've sat down to read an academic text and you've been sitting there and you feel like you have absolutely no idea what you just read. When you are passively reading, you don't retain very much. So when you're actively reading, you're going to retain. You don't have to reread as much, right? Because you did that process of critical thinking throughout. You're going to comprehend at a higher level because you're more structured, right? You're not just sitting down and hoping you remember. You have a purpose. You will, like we talked about, have a better understanding. You're not just memorizing. You are taking that information to the next level. And hopefully you'll have a higher level of enjoyment because it won't seem so daunting. If something seems daunting, definitely try active reading, break it down, find something that's going to work for you. You want to make it accessible for what's going to work best with your learning style. Here's some tips. Don't rush it. If you don't understand something you read, write down a question about it and then reread it again. You don't want to just, I don't get it, move on, right? Try to think of it from a different lens. Think of a question. Like I said, utilize those other tools such as maybe YouTube or Googling some other tips about it. This is something very interesting. For every 20 pages of reading, you should only have one full page of notes. So if you're someone like me that writes everything down, really, really work on finding a way to condense what you are writing. That's going to help with that retention. If you're a visual person, visualize what the text is describing. If it's talking about a hospital setting, close your eyes and think of an example of being in a hospital setting. I think visualization actually helps a lot for visual learners. Paint that picture of what you are reading in your head. That's actually going to give you some key points. Maybe when you're in the test, you're like, oh, I remember that because in my head, I visualized what was going on. This can greatly improve your retention. It's a really good skill if you are a visual learner. Connect the dots. This can be hard if the text is dense or you're having difficulty with it. But if you're like have an aha moment where you're like, oh, I totally get how that connects to this larger context, write that down. When you have those aha moments, or if something starts to click, write it down, right? Put a star next to it, put it in a box. You really want to make sure that you can draw your attention back to this. Clarify and summarize. If you are having a hard time, this is a really good technique. If you're having a hard time reading, think you're not retaining anything, summarize what you just read in a sentence, or even say out loud. So this is what I just read. Evaluate. Do you agree with what you read? Sometimes you're reading articles that give opinions, right? Or they are trying to make an argument. Do you agree with it? What was confusing to you? What was clear to you? Write everything down. This is that active piece where you are actively engaging with the text. I promise you, if you at least try one of these techniques, something is going to stick. And this is definitely a muscle we have to practice, right? It's like a brain muscle that we have to work on, is this active reading. So if this is something that is new to you, or you know that reading is like reading a text is very daunting to you, or it feels overwhelming, try to at least commit to trying one of these tips and see what works for you. But you might need to play with a few, because what works for some people might not work for others. I'm going to keep providing some of these very easy to digest study tips. However, if you are looking for more study content, you can contact us at agentsofchangeprep.com. You can also find us on our website, agentsofchangeprep.com. I have a study course, which has tons and tons of content. It has tons of practice questions, and we have a very, very awesome supportive community. So definitely check that out if you're looking for more study content. And as always, I want to leave you with some words of advice. I first want to thank you for tuning in. I hope that you at least took a few tips from today that will help you. And I just wanted to commend you wherever you are in the studying process for committing to sitting for your exam. It is hard, but you can do this. You have all that you need within you to be successful. Thank you for tuning in.